Welcome to Composition and Design Part 2. Here we're looking at a photographer's work that's on the list, Hiroshi Sugimoto. The title of the piece is Union City Drive-In Theater from 1993, and it's an offset lithography, which is kind of a type of a print form, crosses a photography method. So it's like method and print, photography methodology and printmaking methodology combined to make this image. And you can also check out the link or do research on him if you choose for him to be the photographer that you research. So what we're looking at here is a long exposure. So the camera's on a tripod. It's a very small, closed f-stop because you can see how it's a drive-in movie theater. And so the speakers in the foreground are just as sharp as like these trees that could be, let's just say, a mile away. I don't know. All of these marks around the theater are most likely airplane trails. There could be some star trails, but pretty interesting how it's capturing all these different airplanes. And it's in Union City, so that's kind of interesting as well, the location with the different airports that would allow for this many different airplanes to be flying around, especially in 1993. It's no Photoshop here, folks. The bright square is where the movie would be projected, and he would do his exposures for the entire length of the film. So this exposure could be up to 2 hours, maybe more than 2 hours. You can learn more about this project if you Google this photographer, Sugimoto. So this lecture primarily focuses on the required reading, Seeing Like a Camera, that you hopefully have already read. So, or you could even look at it kind of while you're listening to me talk about this particular lecture. So seeing like a camera is a cool concept that will unfold throughout this lecture along with some of the other camera techniques that I will introduce to you. Making choices about your camera settings, and your camera settings would be your f-stop, shutter speed, the ISO setting, if you're shooting in RAW or JPEG, all of the things that you would set on your camera, the location, wherever you're making the photos, the framing, and the subjects will all affect the meaning of your photographs. So here we have a photo by Vivian Maier, really interesting photographer. I strongly encourage you to check out, this is a preview of a video that I think you can watch on Netflix about her life. She was someone who never showed her photographs while she was living, and a person like you or I kind of came across them at a estate sale, and purchased all of these negatives, a box of negatives for $300, $400, and it changed that person's life. And she's now a very, I don't know if I want to say sought after, but she's caused a ripple in the idea of the history of photography. So you can learn more about her if you choose. Her image shows us a picture of a couple of different techniques. It's an example of a fast shutter speed, right? Because we're seeing a little bit of movement in the wing, but for the most part, these birds that are probably moving are pretty sharp. And we're also seeing minimum depth of field, so the background isn't as sharp as the subject. So probably maybe like f2.8. So those are some of the things that I'll talk about in this lecture. This is another example of her work with a slower shutter speed, creating more of a unique kind of ghosty vibe to the gentleman walking with, I think that's Audrey Hepburn, but I'm not sure. Could just be a look-alike. So you're still seeing minimum depth of field and motion because they're probably walking. She might have also been stepping forwards or backwards. And again, if you want to learn more about her and look at a bunch of her cool street photography, there's a link for it here. And this just talks a little bit about the things that I was mentioning before, who she was, how long she photographed, and the fact that she never really had any interest in showing her work in her lifetime. But she made some pretty incredible photos. Pictures translate the world you see. So this is a photograph by Sebastian Salgado, and this is an important quote because one of the things that I want you to be thinking about is how you see the world, utilizing these techniques that I'm introducing to you, composition and design. But that's the cool thing about learning about composition and design. It just helps you see the world and show the world to your viewers with a little bit more specificality. So you're more specific in what you want your viewer to look at. So Sebastian Salgado is a wonderful documentary photographer, and this is an image that he photographed portraying, these men are covered in petroleum oil, and just the expression that's happening without really even seeing their faces. They just look pretty devastated, and what a gross feeling. This is also from the same project, and again, just exploring the danger, how horrible the toxins and all of that come from working in the oil fields. And this is also an example of a very fast shutter speed because we're stopping the motion. So you consider and decide how you frame and expose your photographs. And of course, those of you that are using phones, you're not going to have much control over the exposure. You're only going to be able to control the framing composition, which I think that still allows you a lot of creative freedom. But if you did choose to get a camera and took control over your shutter speed and f-stops, you can get some really cool images. This is another picture by Sebastian Salgado called Immigrations. And there's a couple of videos here that you can watch. I'm sorry, migrations. I'm like, that's not immigrations. I don't know if you realize this, but I'm very dyslexic, so my mind plays tricks on me from time to time. There's a bunch of videos here that you can watch. You'll learn more about who Sebastian Salgado is and what Salgado and what his photographs are like. So this is a great example of a slower shutter speed because the people are moving and they're a little bit out of focus. I think this photograph is from India. And the trains are still. So it's a small f-stop, maybe like f16, f22, maybe a half a second or so shutter speed. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about is not only the technical aspects, but how you as a photographer can take more control over the meaning, content, design, and technical skills of your images. And I'm just going to mention a lot of this to you. I know a lot of you are using your phones, but I encourage you to think about borrowing a camera, and it takes time to learn about all this stuff, but it might be worth your while. So here's an example of, taking control of your images and being aware of what's happening. So this is a great photo by Diane Arbus. And I'm just going to talk about it technically. So it's a minimum depth of field. She's exposing for the shadows because the highlights are a little bit overexposed, which makes sense. The subject matter is standing in the shadows. This is a good example of working on choosing the right image for what you want to communicate, the ideas, the subject matter, the best image to select so you have the best use of content, exposure, quality of light for what your intentions are, what you want to show as the photographer. So here's all the pictures that Diane Arbus took with a film camera. I think this picture was probably made in the 1950s. And you can see she's photographing this little boy in Central Park in New York. And there's lots of really sweet, idyllic pictures. There's one picture where he's holding a fake grenade and has this very problematic expression on his face. And that was the picture that she chose to exhibit. And of course, the man, when he saw it as an adult, was pretty bummed. But it just shows that you need to take a lot of pictures and then decide which is the one that best communicates your message. Here's more of her work, just so you can get familiar with all these different photographers. She was considered a documentary photographer. She's really famous for photographing the marginalized people at that particular time, dwarfs, giants, transgender people, nudist circus performers. So her photographs predominantly are from the 1940s to the late 1960s. And she was really one of the first female photographers to really tackle this idea of subcultures and how to document them with as much respect and kindness as you can. She's a really interesting photographer to learn more about. So being prepared when you take photographs is a combination of both being ready with the exposure you visually want to create and making choices of when you take the photograph. And that's called the decisive moment. So you're ready to take the picture. You've figured out what your f-stop and shutter speed combination is going to be. And then you usually take a couple of different shots, and hopefully you get one that communicates your message and is what they call the decisive moment. And if you want to learn more about that, you can Google it. But it's really important to think about how to choose the best image, and if the decisive moment is what you're looking for, being prepared in the moment with the right exposure so you get what you're visually intending to get. These are more examples of this idea of the decisive moment in street photography. And again, if you Google decisive moment, you're going to get a lot of really interesting images. And I'm sorry I don't know all the names of these photographers. Sometimes when I'm doing my research, I don't always have time to collect everyone's names, but they're great examples of something called a decisive moment. So quality of light is something I'd like for you to think about with this learning unit and the images that you're going to be making that you'll turn in sort of for the end of this particular learning unit, so I can evaluate what you gained. So quality of light, do you expose for the highlights or the Do you expose for the highlights or the shadows? Do you want the light to be soft or hard? What is the direction of the light? So to better understand photography, looking at lots of different photographers' work for inspiration and ideas is really key, which is one of the reasons why I'm requiring that you research at a different set of photographers than you did for the history photography learning unit. This is the work of Ray K. Metzler. This is from 1981. And as you can see, he has specifically exposed for the highlights. The shadows are all much, much darker, right? And when you choose to decide for the highlights or the shadows, and you can do this with your phone as well, you can point your phone and dial up and down your exposure quality and still make decisions about how you capture your images with your phone in a similar way, not as sophisticated as you can with your camera. So we're going to talk a little bit about lighting. So these are the 4 important qualities of light that I want you to consider. I believe that the quality of light plays a major role in how your photographs visually communicate your ideas, style, and subject matter. The quality of the light will emphasize the content, composition, and design in your photographs. So contrast is the first one, which is the direction in illumination, the difference in illumination between the lit and the ambient sides, the highlights and the shadows. So just to kind of simplify it, contrast is the difference between the highlights and the shadows. Direction, the direction of the light is the position of the light in relationship to the subject. So is it frontal lighting, side lighting, lighting coming from above, which is often the sun, lighting from beneath, or lighting from behind, where you can create a silhouette. So the direction of the lighting has a big impact. The intensity, how bright or dim is the light? Oftentimes the intensity comes from the distance. So is the light really close to the subject, or is it further away? Hardness and softness. Hardness and softness is connected to the contrast, but it's speaking more about the actual light. So is the quality of the light, is it sharp or is it diffused? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And you usually recognize that again by paying attention to what kind of shadow is being made. So here's an example of hard light. And so we've got like the direct light of the sun powering down, sorry about that, onto the street. We're exposing for the highlights, which means the shadows are all going black. And it's also talking about composition. It's a higher camera perspective, so it's called that bird's eye view. It's another example of Ray Metzler's work. If you look him up, you're going to find that most of his work has very high contrast, where the highlight, he's almost always exposing for the highlights and letting the shadows go to this very dark black color. So he thinks about the time of day to get those results. So you can pay attention to that as well. So defining hard light with an example of a photograph by Roy Gibson, who's also creating this very hard light from the sun. So it's illuminating half of the subject's face and the other half is in shadow. A hard light source is a bare flash, the sun, and the hard light creates a very sharp edge. The shadows are always like what you see here, a distinction between the highlights and the shadows. And to get this, again, you would need to expose for the highlights. So hard light is created by strongly focused light traveling from a small or relatively small, a single source light like the sun. So the sun can make a really distinctive light even though it's not small, but because it's so far away and so powerful. A focused beam of light or undiffused light bulb. And that's something you could think about if you're going to mess around with lighting for this project. Take the lampshade off your light and just use the raw light bulb. It's off camera, so no one's going to see it. The transition from light to dark gets progressively smaller as light gets harder. Hard light creates harsh, sharp lines in the shadow and no transition from light to dark. So one of the ways to distinguish hard light is there's not really a transition. It just goes from something being very bright to very dark with this distinctive line. So hard light is created when lighting is direct, undiffused, and is not bouncing or scattered by objects or conditions. The flash on your camera is a hard light source when direct or undiffused clouds by the sun. So you can get that when it's not a cloudy day. When it's a cloudy day, it's going to be diffused light. And the source is oftentimes at a distance, like I was explaining. Here's some more examples of working with later afternoon light. And so this is a nice sunny day, probably in Southern California. This is hard light. These are photographs by Hugh Holland. And you can see these cool long shadows that are being made by that direct sun, and then how they have kind of a warm feeling to them as well. Here's another example of hard light. Now this is coming from behind, so the direction of light is having an impact on the photo. It's a faster shutter speed because we're seeing the raindrops, so it's probably maybe like about a 60th to a 30th of a second, and it's a smaller f-stop because everything is pretty sharp. Another example of hard light getting from a silhouette, so you can see the sun. It's also kind of backlit. Here's an example of natural soft diffused light from an overcast or cloudy day. This is the work of Myung-Ho Lee, really interesting photographer who does these portraits of trees. So he hires people to help him to find, kind of install these huge canvas backdrops to isolate the tree and do kind of this traditional concept of portraiture with the tree. Most of his work has this very diffuse lighting quality. And here's an example of him with, the elaborate crew that he has to create these backdrops. It's pretty powerful. And if you study his work, you'll notice that, here we have maybe not quite such a cloudy day as what some of this other work looks like, but he's maybe waited until the sun goes behind one of these clouds. He doesn't want a lot of shadows or highlights. He wants everything to be very evenly illuminated. It's part of his creative process. I really like this person's work. I highly encourage you to check it out. So soft light is then created, the soft light creates shadows that are very gradual. So there's a transition. You can even kind of see it on Meryl Streep's neck. There's not like a hard line created from the light. So soft light is created when lighting is indirect or when it passes through a diffuser, clouds, or some other medium which scatters the light. So as you can see here, this is a softbox. You can use anything to diffuse the light. So bubble wrap is a great light diffuser. You can put it on the window or in front of your lamp. A very thin piece of light colored fabric. And there's, on the quality of lighting page, there's a bunch of different links to resources. And you can also Google whatever type of light you're looking for and potentially watch a tutorial. This is the work of Annie Leibovitz. She's fashion photographer and does a lot of work for Vogue and other movie stars, the movie industry. This is Peter Hugo's work. He's a South American photographer, and he's got some really interesting examples again of soft diffuse light. And I think the light in his photographs are diffused because of the pollution. So you're probably wondering, what are these photos about? I encourage you to do some research on him. This is a project he did called Nollywood, and these are street characters, but you should learn more about his work and his process. He's a very fascinating artist that was a photojournalist and then started doing more of his own documentary fine art work. So as you notice, you can see how it's an overcast day, possibly a little bit of overcast with pollution. I don't know, but it's definitely not direct light. There's not a direct sun coming in. And I've already got a bunch of links for you to check out if you want to learn more about what his work is about, since the images have a kind of a shock value to them. I really like this one in particular. It's just pretty creepy for numerous reasons, but I think that the overall saturation of the photo, the fact that he used a slower shutter speed, so the cars are showing that movement, and then of course this person's intense gesture, physical body language, what he's wearing, and then this vacant board. I mean, the whole thing is just really otherworldly, and it is otherworldly. I haven't ever been to Africa. It's one of the places I would definitely like to visit. Another photographer who's using soft diffused light, mostly, these is available light, so the sun is the light source, but the sun is behind clouds, and so you're just getting the diffused look. This is the work of Mike Brody. He's an interesting photographer who kind of followed young kids who were choosing to live the life on jumping the train cars. So time of day is going to be a really important consideration with the images that you make. And I want you to think about what time of day you make your pictures, and I want you to consider the quality of light. So just think about, just right here, it's showing you that there's direction, that the light is going to come from a specific direction. And you see that when you walk around sunrise, the light is very different than at sunset. The coloring, the intensity of it, the contrast it creates. At noon, it's going to be very flat because it's overhead. And you can watch this tutorial or other, tutorials to learn more about how can you manipulate and work with daylight. So later in the afternoon, the light is directional and it's oftentimes warm. Depending upon where you're on the planet and what time of year it is, you can have really cool light in the morning and really warm light in the afternoon. This is the work of Colleen Plum. She has a bunch of different products, and you can check out her work as well. Another example of that kind of softer, more diffused morning light. If the sun is coming up behind you, the sun isn't going to be in your photo, so you're going to get like this really pretty colors in the sky. Pete Turner is another really good example of someone to look for inspiration for really using that concept of color that was mentioned in the composition lecture, and also time of day and quality of light. I just love the way that this fence kind of changes shape and design just because of the natural vantage point that the photographer took, and then the car lights at the very end. These are also obviously not Photoshop. These are from the 1950s and 60s. So what is in the picture? This goes back to the article that you should have read. What is in the picture? It's really important to think about, well, what's my message, right? That's something that you're supposed to be thinking about, not only the composition and design, but what's the content and the subject matter. So here we have the same subject matter, a truck with some pumpkins. It could be around Thanksgiving. It could be a pumpkin patch, but we have two very different messages here. This is really describing the pumpkin patch, and the truck is sort of just an object that the pumpkins are near. This is much more about the truck. And so what is your subject matter? How do you want to frame it? And then what do you put, again, going back to composition, and a couple of things are happening here. What image do you decide? What do you think is the best photograph that you made? And taking different pictures of the same scene. So exploring it from different perspectives. Picking a perspective and then continuing to work with it until a decisive moment happens where you're ready, your subject makes a gesture, and it all comes together. So it doesn't mean that you can't take a lot of pictures before you get to that decisive moment, but to be ready for it and then like, oh, I got it, right? It's a good example of a faster shutter speed because the moving birds are in focus, his gesture, his arm is in focus, background is out of focus. So a more open f-stop, minimum depth of field. Always think about that concept of the edge of the frame and how do you want to use that? Larry Fink is someone that we talked about, and he's really using it in a very different, unique way. He's always looking to see how can I frame my image differently. So that's something I want to encourage you to think about as well. Show the viewer something that they haven't seen before. You don't need to just photograph the musician, but photograph the scene in a unique way. And you still get the musician. More images by Larry Fink, a really good person who's using his camera to frame the world in unexpected ways. This is a great project, looking in the rearview mirror of your car. So you not only get what you're going towards or what you're in or whatever, but you also get what's behind you. I had a student once do a project where they parked their car and got all these great sunsets in the rear view mirror, and then they were looking at some other beautiful landscape as well. So there's all different ways for you to think about how to use your camera in just unexpected ways. So what's behind your subject? Really consider your background. You can sometimes just take a few minutes, have your subject turn around. You can have better lighting, a more simple background, whatever you choose to do for your images. And not to say that having all the pots in the background is a bad idea. It just depends upon what you want. Do you want something more simple that's really just about this little boy? Or do you want to tell a story about how this little boy likes to pot plants barefoot? It's depending upon what your message is. This is a good example. These are just beautiful pictures of flowers. But again, like what I talked about before, your perspective, just shifting a little bit, you can just hide the dead flowers and isolate the one flower with a more, what I feel, a more pleasing composition. If you can't move your subject to have the ideal background, use what is in the background to contribute to your photograph, either with the content or the ideas, the symbolism you're trying to show. So this is the work by Volter der Gertier. He's I think a Belgium or a Norwegian photographer. Sorry, I forgot. And I just love the irony here. We have these, gentlemen that are walking across the street in their gowns because they're some sort of, monastery monks or something with the nuns. And then in the background, you've got all these Liz Claiborne ads, virtually selling sex and underwear and things like that. So it's playing around with what's in the background. That's another way to navigate the background. But you need to think about the background. And you also need to think about how you line stuff up in your image, which is what a lot of these photographers do, how he's lining up this park 24 hours in a very interesting location. So consider which parts of your photograph are in focus and which parts are not. So this is the work of Catherine Wagner, a photographer who seriously studies locations and situations and prefers to use something called maximum depth of field. So we're talking about focus, and that has to do with your f-stop. It's another image by her. This is actually the Moscone Center when they were first building it, I think in the late 80s. And so this is a good example of maximum depth of field or deep depth of field. I'll mostly refer to it as maximum depth of field. So a really small f-stop. Another example of the Moscone site being built, this is San Francisco many years ago. And if you want to watch a documentary about her work, she's a Bay Area photographer. So you can either choose to have maximum depth of field or minimum depth of field, also known as shallow. And I'm just trying to give you as many terms as possible because different websites will use different language. So this is an image by Sally Mann, and we're seeing how the background isn't as sharp as the subject, so a more open f-stop. Another example of that, this could be like f2.8. So minimum depth of field, the background is not as sharp as the subject. She did a lot of images around her family. You can watch an interview with her or look at any of these websites. She's one of my favorite. My gosh, I'm probably going to say that a million times. I have numerous favorite photographers, but she's definitely one of my faves. Another example of minimum depth of field, this is the work of Steve McCurry. He does a lot of documentary projects in different parts of the world. Alex Webb, another example where the subject in the foreground, so he's using a couple of cool techniques, probably like 5, 6, so the background is just a little bit out of focus, but still recognizable. And he's got the subject in the foreground and using the rule of thirds compositional style. This is the work of Ernst Haas. He's a Magnum photographer. And I'm just mentioning and talking a little bit about how you can control that effect of depth of field. So you need to have an open f-stop. You need to consider the size of your sensor, the focal length of your lens, and the distance between the subject, the objects in the scene, and the camera. So here, pretty cool, interesting photo. The camera is probably sitting on the dashboard of a car, but it's focused on this building. So things in the foreground are going to be out of focus. The building is going to be in focus. So we're getting the illusion of minimum depth of field just because this part of the photograph, the information that is there is so close to the lens, it's automatically out of focus. So here's what f-stops look like in your camera. They range usually from around 2.8 to 22. There's a bunch of different ways how you can change your f-stops, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to get into the details of that, but you can Google tutorials if you are using a camera, and the more open your f-stop, the more limited area of focus you have, so what I call minimum depth of field, and the more closed your f-stop is going to be more like maximum depth of field, where the image is going to be in focus from the foreground to the middle ground to the background. This is kind of showing you how different focal length lenses will affect that concept of depth of field. So here, the big difference when you have a shorter millimeter lens, so 16 millimeter, compared to a longer millimeter lens, which is 200. So this would be like a telephoto lens. This is a super wide angle lens. And you can just see how different the background looks. And that's just due to the technique, the way that the lens actually functions. So shutter speed. This is usually the range of shutter speeds that most of your digital cameras come with. From one, well, actually there's usually B, which stands for bulb, which means you can leave it for your shutter speed open as long as you desire. But the manual ones usually go from 1 second up to 4,000th of a second. And these are called one-stop difference. And again, I'm not going to get into that, but maybe at another point it will come up. Or you can watch a tutorial about shutter speeds. So this is a really great, if you're really interested in learning about your exposures, having total control, you're basically, when I encourage you to use manual, I encourage you to watch tutorials, but anytime you open up your f-stop, so let's say you take a meter reading and it's f8 at 1/25th of a second, and you say, oh, I want minimum depth of field. So I'm going to open up 1, 2, 3 stops. You would need to then close down your shutter speed, 1, 2, 3, to get like the right exposure, because you've let light more in. You're letting more light in, so you need to let less light in. And another thing that controls this is the ISO settings that you might use. And all of this can be learned through a lot of tutorials. Unfortunately, I'm not going to go into details because that's not really what this class is about. but I look forward to hopefully teaching another class that would go into those details. More examples of giving you the opportunity to see how an open f-stop makes the background out of focus as you start to close down, which is the terminology that people use, to a smaller f-stop. Then you have the subject and the background, the foreground and the background in focus. This is just showing you the differences of the shutter speeds. When you have 1/1000th of a second, you're stopping motion with a fast shutter speed. As you start to open up your shutter speed, you are slowing down and you're going to a 1/2 second, so the motion is being blurred. And then this is just talking about the sensitivity, which isn't really exactly how it is anymore, because they've changed if you're using a full frame sensor. But again, I'm just gonna, if you're curious about it, you can send me an email. Unfortunately, this camera simulator is no longer a free app, but it's really cool if you want to learn about these concepts. It's something you could sign up for 7 days for free and just get a sense of like, oh my gosh, so many cool things that you can do. This is a great example of stop motion with a fast shutter speed, super open f-stop, so the background's out of focus, and they're exposing for not quite the highlights, but probably these highlights. So the middle tones of the highlights. So time and motion in a photograph. So blurring or showing motion happens when you use a longer shutter speed. This is the work of Michael Kenna. He does a lot of night photography. This is probably a few hours exposure, and I think it's in Shanghai. Some more examples of his work. So the water gets really milky because his exposures are longer. So we're seeing the movement of the clouds in the water. It's showing the motion. More examples of his work, and some links to websites showing more of his work if you want to check it out. This is kind of just a pretty generic idea of a fast shutter speed stopping motion, a slightly slower speed, sort of like in the middle, not quite stopped, not quite showing, and then a longer, slower shutter speed, 1/2 second or something, really showing the motion. So maybe like 1/500th, 1/30, 1/60th, and then maybe 1/2 second. And these are examples of longer shutter speeds. This is an example of rack focusing. It's a really cool effect. There's a link, hopefully it still works. Whoops, sorry. Where you're basically doing a slightly longer shutter speed and you're zooming with your lens. So that's a pretty cool feature that you can play around with. You probably would need a tripod to do it correctly, but it really gives you some cool zoom effects. And here's an example of panning, which means that you're moving while you take the photo. So here's kind of showing you how you do that. If you set your camera to a 30th of a second and the person on the bike rides by, they're out of focus. If you set it at 500th of a second, you stop motion, showing motion, stop motion. You need to have the motion in a direction to see it, otherwise you're not going to get the same effect. And then this is panning, where you actually move your camera during the exposure so the background is out of focus and the subject is sharp. So you can try that. These are examples of panning if you want to get into that style or technique in your photographs. Such an awesome photo. I am not good at panning, but these photographers are. Or stopping motion, so using a faster shutter speed, something over 1/25th of a second. So we're stopping the motion of these dancers. Here's a good example of a fast shutter speed to stop the water droplets and minimum depth of field. Here's another example of a faster shutter speed, kind of, maybe a 60th of a second, 30th, depending upon how fast he's throwing that out, and maximum depth of field, because everything from the foreground, middle ground to background is in focus. So maybe, let's say f30th at, 1/30th at f22. And thank you for your time. So that just introduced you to all these great concepts. Keep me posted with questions. Thanks.